A pregnant dog lies shivering in the bitter snow, ribs protruding, eyes filled with quiet desperation. Just steps away, behind a closed door, an elderly man sits alone, lost in grief, convinced his story is over. Neither knows it yet, but tonight their paths will cross, and two broken souls will find healing in the most unexpected way. The city of Rotterdam lay silent beneath a thick quilt of snow, muffling the hum of traffic and softening even the sharpest corners of brick and concrete. It was one of those winter nights where everything felt suspended, as if time itself had curled up to sleep. Inside apartment 3B of an aging four-story building on Vanderlaan Street, Elias Vermeer sat motionless in his worn green armchair, a blanket draped across his knees and a half-empty cup of tea growing cold on the end table. Elias was 70, tall but slightly stooped, with wisps of silver hair combed neatly back from a thoughtful brow. His eyes, once keen and curious, now carried the weight of solitude. Clear blue, but dimmed by too many quiet years. A retired art teacher, Elias had spent most of his life painting vibrant canvases and guiding young hands through the mysteries of color and line. But since his wife Clara passed away 5 winters ago, the world had lost much of its color for him. The apartment had grown quiet, too quiet, and though he kept it tidy, every surface seemed to whisper memories. He reached for the remote to turn off the evening news when he heard it, barely audible at first, almost mistaken for wind. But then it came again, a high, tremulous whimper, more plea than sound. Elias paused, heart tightening. It wasn't the TV, it wasn't the wind. Setting his cup down, he rose slowly, his joints complaining. He crossed the narrow living room past the framed sketch of Clara smiling in the garden, and opened the heavy front door. A wave of icy air rushed in, biting at his skin and scattering a few snowflakes onto the rug. And there, just beneath the flickering lamplight of the alley, huddled against the base of the stair railing, was a dog. Not just any dog, a German shepherd, rail-thin and trembling, her fur wet with snow. Her ribs showed stark beneath her coat, and her belly bulged unnaturally, a swollen arc that told Elias she was heavy with puppies. She lifted her head weakly at the sound of the door. Their eyes met. Hers were amber, bright, but hollowed by exhaustion and something deeper. Not fear, not quite hope. A quiet, desperate trust. Elias hesitated. He hadn't had a pet since childhood. Clara had been allergic. Still, he found himself stepping outside, his slippers crunching softly on the snow-dusted tile. "You poor thing," he murmured, kneeling slowly. His knees protested, but he ignored them. "What are you doing out here, girl?" The dog didn't growl, didn't shy away. She simply looked at him, her breathing shallow, her body shaking with cold. Elias reached out gingerly and touched her shoulder. Her fur was icy, and beneath it he could feel how fragile she'd become. She whimpered again, barely a sound. "Well," he sighed, glancing up at the swirling snow, "Clara would say this is madness." But he bent lower, hooked one arm gently beneath her front legs and the other under her haunches, and lifted. She was lighter than expected, and warm in only the saddest sense, body heat fading, not thriving. As he carried her inside, he didn't notice the light flicker on in the apartment downstairs, or the figure behind the curtain who had been watching. Maureen de Vries stood at her kitchen window, arms crossed, gaze narrowed. She was 45, with a long, angular frame and a face that seemed to carry both strength and sorrow in equal measure. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose braid, and she wore a navy cardigan over flannel pajamas. Once a veterinary nurse, Maureen had given up the profession 3 years earlier, after a tragic accident claimed her 10-year-old son, Oscar. Since then, she had lived alone, speaking little and keeping mostly to herself. But tonight, as she watched the quiet, reclusive Mr. Vermeer cradle a pregnant street dog in his arms, something stirred in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. A memory. Oscar kneeling beside a wounded pigeon, whispering encouragement as Maureen bandaged its wing. She turned away quickly, wiping at her eyes with the sleeve of her cardigan. Back upstairs, Elias laid the dog carefully on a thick bath towel spread across the couch. He fetched another towel from the linen closet, warmed it in the dryer for a minute, then tucked it gently around her. She watched him, breathing slow and shallow, but calm. "You need a name," he said softly, sitting beside her. "Just until I can figure out what to do with you." He studied her noble face, the intelligent eyes, the dignity still clinging to her despite her ragged state. "Freya," he decided. "Yes, that suits you." Freya blinked at him once, then closed her eyes. Elias remained in his chair long after the heat came back into the room, long after the snow had started to pile up outside the window. He listened, not for news reports, not for traffic or time, but for the soft, rhythmic breathing beside him. A sign of life, of presence. Later that night, as he prepared a small dish of warm broth from the pantry and watched Freya lift her head just enough to sip it gratefully, Elias felt something crack open in the silence of his chest. He had not intended to take in a dog, certainly not one about to give birth. But the apartment already felt less hollow. Downstairs, Maureen stood at her window again, this time sipping tea. She could see the glow of Elias's living room, shadows moving gently inside. The snow continued to fall outside, soft as secrets. Maureen touched her necklace, Oscar's initials carved into a silver charm, and whispered to the night, "Maybe. It's time." Freya slept soundly, her body curled into a half-moon, safe and warm at last. Elias watched her from his armchair, wrapped again in the same blanket, but this time not quite so tightly. The sound of her slow breathing echoed softly through the room, and for the first time in years the night didn't feel so long. Tomorrow, he told himself, he'd figure out what came next. But for tonight, it was enough that she had come. By the time morning touched the rooftops of Vanderlaan Street, the storm had eased into a fine, gentle snowfall. The city was still buried beneath a sea of white, and Elias Vermeer stood at the kitchen window in a flannel robe, holding a chipped porcelain mug of black tea. He watched his breath fog up the glass, though his thoughts were somewhere else entirely, somewhere softer, closer. Behind him, curled tightly on a folded blanket near the radiator, Freya slept. Her breaths came steady now, and though she remained thin and weary, the twitch of her ears and the occasional thump of her tail in sleep suggested safety. Elias had been up since dawn. The moment he heard her stir, he'd filled a bowl with warm broth and another with fresh water. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He watched her cautiously, not used to sharing his space, not used to the tiny pulsing sense of urgency her presence stirred inside him. The flat, once muted and filled with echoes, now felt almost awake. He was stirring oats on the stove when the thought occurred to him. He couldn't do this alone, not properly. Not if she was going to give birth, which, judging by the size of her belly, could be any day now. Elias wasn't completely clueless about animals. Clara had adored reading veterinary articles, and he had absorbed things through proximity, but birthing, that was beyond him. He dried his hands and crossed the room to the phone. A dusty magnet clung to the fridge, a business card tucked underneath, yellowed with age. Dr. Astrid Reiter, Home Veterinary Services. He remembered the name. Astrid had visited once, years ago, when his wife tried to nurse a dove back to health. She had been young then. Kind eyes, confident hands, a quiet strength that didn't boast. He picked up the receiver and dialed. The voice on the other end when it answered was deeper now, more measured, but still unmistakably warm. "Dr. Ryder speaking." Elias hesitated, then cleared his throat. "It's Elias Vermeer. You may not remember. Clara and there was a dove." "I remember," she said gently. "The one who refused to eat unless opera was playing. How is Clara?" There was a pause. "She passed 5 years ago." "I'm sorry to hear that, Elias, truly. What can I help you with?" He explained, haltingly at first, about the dog, the snow, her condition. Dr. Ryder didn't interrupt. When he finished, she said simply, "I'll be there in an hour." Exactly 53 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Elias opened the door to a woman in her late 40s, tall and lean, her cheeks flushed with cold. Astrid's hair was steel blonde and tightly braided, and her eyes, still kind, were rimmed with crow's feet born not of age, but of years spent squinting in worry or compassion. She wore a dark navy coat with a stethoscope tucked into the front pocket, and she carried a large canvas bag that clinked faintly with instruments. Freya watched the newcomer from her spot by the radiator, ears up but body still. Astrid knelt slowly, her movements fluid and respectful. "Well, aren't you a proud girl?" she said softly. "Mind if I take a look, sweet thing?" Elias sat nearby as Astrid worked, gently palpating Freya's abdomen, listening to her heartbeat, checking her gums and eyes. Her voice turned clinical but never cold. "She's pregnant. I'd say she's about 6 weeks along. That gives us maybe 2 or 3 weeks, depending. She's undernourished but strong. No signs of infection. No fleas, either, which is rare for a stray. She's not chipped?" Astrid shook her head. "No, and no collar. I'd say she's been on her own for a while. But she must have come from a good home once. She's calm, trusting. That kind of temperament doesn't happen on the street." As Astrid repacked her bag, she pulled out a few small items. Canned food, a vitamin supplement, even a collapsible water bowl. "Keep her warm, quiet. If you have a spare room, set up a nest in there. Soft blankets, dim lighting. Let her choose where she feels safest." A spare room. Elias hadn't stepped into the second bedroom since Clara died. The door remained shut like a museum exhibit, dust collecting in streaks along the baseboard. "I'll do that," he said, almost to himself. Astrid paused. "You're doing something good, Elias, really good." After she left, silence settled again. But not the old silence. This one was laced with movement. Elias gathered towels, a thick duvet, and an old pillow Clara had once embroidered. He opened the spare bedroom door slowly. The smell of disuse met him first, old wood, lavender, and the faintest trace of Clara's perfume. Dust swirled in the sunlight like memory made visible. He stood in the doorway for a long while. Then he went to work. He aired out the window, vacuumed the floor, and arranged the blankets into a makeshift nest in the corner, beneath a floor lamp that cast a golden light across the wooden floor. He left the door open. Freya would come when she was ready. As he placed a final cushion beside the lamp, there was a knock at the door. Surprised, Elias opened it to find a woman standing there in a gray wool coat, her breath visible in the air. She held a reusable shopping bag in one hand. "Hi," she said awkwardly. "I'm Maureen. I live just below you." Elias blinked. He knew the name vaguely from the building's tenant list, but they'd never spoken more than a polite nod in the hallway. Maureen looked to be in her mid-40s, tall and slender with tired, striking eyes, green flecked with amber, and a strong jaw. Her hair was reddish-brown, cut to her shoulders, and pushed behind one ear. There was something guarded in her posture, like someone constantly bracing for news she didn't want to hear. "I saw you last night," she added quickly, "with the dog. I thought maybe she could use this." She handed him the bag. Inside were several cans of high-quality dog food, a chew toy, and a small blanket. "She looked like she's about to pop," Maureen said. "I used to work with animals. Vet nurse a while ago." Elias stepped aside. "Would you like to come in?" Maureen hesitated, then nodded. Inside, she crouched beside Freya, who sniffed her hand, then laid her head down without protest. Maureen smiled faintly. "She's a sweetheart." "She's changed the whole place already," Elias admitted. "I didn't think well, I didn't expect this." Maureen looked up at him. Animals have a way of walking in through the cracks. For the next 20 minutes they talked. About Freya, about the snow. Elias mentioned his late wife, Clara. Maureen spoke only briefly of her son, Oscar, and then went quiet. But something unspoken passed between them in that silence, recognition, perhaps, or quiet respect. When Maureen stood to leave, she paused at the door. "If you need anything, seriously, I'm right downstairs." Elias watched her go, the bag of food now neatly stacked on the counter, the blanket folded beside Freya. Later that evening, Freya stood slowly and of her own accord padded into the spare room. Elias followed her silently. She circled the nest once, then twice, and curled into the soft hollow he'd made. She looked up at him, still watchful but less wary. The floor lamp bathed the room in golden light. He left the door ajar and returned to his chair, heart oddly full. For the first time in 5 years, the room that once felt like a tomb of memory now held something else entirely: expectation and life. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm, marked not by clocks or appointments, but by the subtle signs of shared existence. The snow outside thickened into frozen layers, coating rooftops and muting the city's usual chatter. But inside Elias Vermeer's apartment, something fragile and golden had begun to bloom again. Something he had not dared to name in years. He rose earlier than usual now, his steps light with purpose. Every morning, Freya greeted him not with noise, but with presence. Those amber eyes lifting from her blanket nest in the spare room, her tail tapping lightly against the floor. Though still weak, she moved with more surety each day. She followed him from room to room, her paws silent on the hardwood floors. A quiet companion who asked for little but gave much. Elias began cleaning in earnest. He dusted shelves, cleared cluttered corners, and swept away years of settled quiet. He scrubbed the windows until the snow outside gleamed like powdered glass and opened the kitchen curtains for the first time in months. The house had never looked extravagant. Clara had preferred function over form. But as the sunlight streamed in, bouncing off the pale yellow walls, Elias felt as if he were restoring something sacred. In the living room, he created a small corner for Freya. A thick oval rug layered with old quilts, a repurposed basket lined with a flannel sheet, and a new water bowl he'd purchased from a local shop run by a round, cheerful woman named Saskia. Saskia, who wore knitted hats in every color and spoke like she had known you all her life, had smiled knowingly when Elias had nervously asked about betting for a pregnant dog. "Ah, Freya," she'd said, as if the name were ancient magic. "She's lucky you opened your door. Most men your age would have just shut the blinds." He'd blushed under her warm gaze and muttered something about doing what anyone would have done. She'd laughed softly. "You'd be surprised how many don't." Back at home, he lit candles again. Just small ones, flickering in corners. Clara had loved candles. They made the silence feel sacred, not lonely. Freya took to lying beside him now in the evenings, her body curled against the couch as Elias read aloud. Old stories, poetry, sometimes nothing more than descriptions of weather or food. She didn't seem to mind. Sometimes she'd lift her head and blink slowly, her ears turning at the sound of his voice. Other times, she simply listened, still and breathing, as if the sound was enough. It was during one of those quiet evenings that there came another knock at the door. Maureen de Vries stood in the hallway with a folded cardboard box in her arms. Her auburn hair was pulled into a messy bun, a faint smudge of what looked like flour dusted one cheek, and her dark sweater bore signs of an energetic cat, or perhaps an overly affectionate scarf. Still, her presence was calm, her voice warm. "I brought supplies," she said, lifting the box a little. "Things I had in storage. Might be helpful once the puppies arrive." Elias stepped aside without a word, and Maureen entered. Freya, from her place on the rug, looked up briefly, then lowered her head again. Elias noticed she didn't retreat, not even when Maureen came closer. "She remembers you," Elias said quietly. "I'm glad." Maureen placed the box on the kitchen table. Inside were small towels, sterile pads, heating packs, and a few unopened cans of premium dog food. At the bottom, Elias spotted a weathered, hand-knitted toy, a stuffed rabbit missing an eye. "That belonged to Oscar," Maureen said, noticing his gaze. "He used to give it to the cats at the shelter when they were scared." Elias looked at her, uncertain. She met his eyes. "He died 3 years ago. Car accident. He was 10. A silence settled between them. Elias didn't fill it. He simply nodded, moved slowly to the cabinet, and poured 2 mugs of tea. They sat across from each other, elbows on the table, their conversation cautious at first, like people walking barefoot over cracked ice. "He loved animals," she continued, "more than people, I think. Said they never pretended to be something they weren't. I used to bring him with me to work sometimes, let him help with feeding." "You were a vet nurse?" "For nearly 15 years, she said. "Stopped after the accident. Couldn't step into a clinic without seeing him." Elias nodded slowly. "I stopped painting after Clara passed. Everything I put on canvas just looked like her." The words came easier after that. They spoke of the things they missed, the rituals they couldn't shake, and the small ways grief had shaped their days, like water wearing away stone, slow and relentless. By the time the tea grew cold, the silence between them was no longer awkward. It was understanding. When Maureen stood to leave, she paused at the rug where Freya lay. She knelt down and gently placed the stuffed rabbit beside the dog, who sniffed it once before resting her head atop it. Maureen smiled, soft and distant. "She's starting to trust," Elias said. "She knows this is home," Maureen replied. "You've given her that." That night, Elias found himself sitting beside Freya longer than usual. The lamp behind him cast a golden glow across the room. Freya lifted her head, nudged his knee with her nose, and then, in an act of quiet permission, laid it gently across his foot. He reached down slowly and placed his hand on her head. She didn't move. "I suppose we're doing this together," he whispered. The radiator hummed softly. The wind outside carried the rustle of frozen trees, and in the living room that once echoed with memories, a new kind of warmth began to settle. Steady, real, and alive. Snow had returned to Rotterdam like a silent promise, blanketing the streets in soft white stillness that muffled footsteps and quieted the world. The city, already slow in winter, felt suspended, held in a moment where time moved gently, respectfully. Inside Elias Vermeer's apartment, however, time was about to race forward. It began just after dawn. Elias had been in the kitchen, stirring porridge with one hand while cradling his second cup of tea with the other, when he heard a sharp whine. Not the usual low groan Freya made when stretching. This was different, urgent, high-pitched, laced with something ancient and instinctual. He froze, the wooden spoon in his hand pausing mid-air. Freya's soft whimper came again. He dropped the spoon into the pot, sending a small splash of oats over the rim, and hurried to the spare room. The golden lamp still glowed in the corner, casting warmth on the nest of blankets where Freya lay, but she wasn't lying down anymore. She was standing now, her limbs stiff, eyes wide and alert, her tail low and motionless. She turned to look at him, breathing fast, and gave another strained sound that tugged directly at his chest. "Oh, no," Elias whispered, his throat tightening. "Is it time?" He knelt beside her, unsure of what to do, his mind flickering uselessly through memories of documentaries and vague fragments of Clara reading veterinary books aloud. He reached out but then drew back, afraid of doing something wrong. Okay, you've done this before. You know what to do," he muttered aloud, not to her but to himself. "I'm just here to help, just support, breathe." Freya began to circle, her legs stiff and careful. Then she stopped, lowered herself slowly onto the blankets, and let out another sharp breath. Elias stumbled to his feet and reached for the phone. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed the number Maureen had scribbled on a post-it note earlier that week. Her cell, just in case. She picked up on the second ring. "She's in labor," he said, skipping pleasantries. "I'll be right up," Maureen answered without hesitation. Less than 2 minutes later, there was a knock. Elias opened the door to find Maureen wrapped in a thick wool coat, her cheeks red from the cold, a canvas bag in hand. She didn't wait to be invited in. Once inside, her voice became a calm, guiding rhythm. "Boil some water, bring clean towels, keep the room warm but not too hot, and stay with her, talk to her." Elias followed her instructions like a student desperate not to fail. Maureen knelt beside Freya, her fingers gentle but firm. "She's doing great," she said, brushing the dog's ears. "Strong girl, you've got this." Freya let out a low growl, not aggressive but primal, before another contraction seized her body. Maureen placed a reassuring hand on her side. "First, pups always take time, but she's focused." Elias returned with the towels and a bowl of warm water, placing them beside Maureen. He knelt on the other side of Freya, unsure what to say, so he simply spoke what came to mind. "You're not alone, Freya. I'm right here. We're all right here." The next 2 hours unfolded in a breathless haze. The tension ebbed and flowed with each contraction. Freya pushed, whimpered, and panted, her body driven by the old knowledge buried in her bones. Then, at last, the first puppy emerged, a tiny black bundle slick with birth, wriggling helplessly on the towel. Maureen quickly cleaned its nose and mouth, rubbed it briskly with a cloth, and held it out. "A boy," she announced. "Healthy lungs, too." The second came not long after, smaller and softer in color, a rich brown gold that shimmered in the lamplight. Another boy. Elias was the one who held this one first, cradling it in a cloth-lined bowl, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. The third took longer. Freya had grown tired, and Maureen watched closely, her brow creased. But finally, after a deep, shuddering breath, Freya delivered the last pup. This one, light gray with silvery fur so soft it looked like smoke. "A girl," Maureen said, her voice filled with reverence, "and perfect." Elias didn't know when the tears had started, only that they were warm and silent, and came from a place long sealed. Freya licked each puppy in turn, drawing them close. Her body curled protectively around them, and she let out a low sigh, exhausted but triumphant. Maureen packed up quietly, wiping her hands and returning instruments to her bag. "She did beautifully," she said. "All three strong. You've got a good little family now." Elias could only nod. Before Maureen left, she placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You did beautifully too." As the door closed behind her, Elias sat back on his heels and looked at Freya. She was watching him, her eyes calm now, her breathing slower. The puppies nursed greedily, tiny bodies twitching with life. "You're not the only one starting over," Elias said, voice cracking just a little. As the snow fell outside, he leaned against the doorframe, hand still pressed to his chest as if trying to keep this moment from escaping. Later that afternoon, as he sat at the kitchen table wrapped in a blanket, the phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize at first, but when he picked up, the voice was unmistakable. "Hi, Grandpa?" "Mike." Elias straightened. His grandson was 16, tall for his age, with dark, thick hair and a permanently furrowed brow, an expression that made him look like he was always trying to solve something important. He was clever, unusually observant, but had grown quiet in the last year, withdrawn. "Michael," Elias said, surprised. What a nice surprise." There was silence on the other end, then a soft exhale. I needed to talk to someone who doesn't expect me to be perfect." Elias's heart squeezed. "My mom's been on me about university again," Mike continued. "Grades, tests, interviews. I don't even know what I want yet. Everything feels like pressure. Like I'm always 2 steps behind." "You're not," Elias said quietly. "You're exactly where you need to be." There was another pause. Then a hopeful note entered Mike's voice. "Could I come stay with you, just for the winter break? Just to breathe a little?" Elias didn't even hesitate. "I'd like that very much." They talked for another 10 minutes, lighter now, about snow and tea and the unexpected arrival of 3 puppies. When the call ended, Elias sat still for a long moment, the phone resting loosely in his hand. Then he looked toward the spare room, where Freya lay with her newborns. One family had just grown by 3, another was on its way back together. Outside, the snow fell on. But inside, Elias's world was stirring with warmth and movement, and the bright, unpredictable noise of life. The snow had begun to melt in slow glistening ribbons along the rooftops, forming gentle streams that trickled down drain pipes and pooled into quiet puddles along the cobblestone walkways of Vanderland Street. Winter was not yet finished, but it was softening. And inside Elias Vermeer's once quiet apartment, the world had transformed. It started with a bark, short and high-pitched, more squeak than sound. Then a second one, followed by a chorus of tiny yips and the unmistakable sound of paws scrambling over hardwood floors. It had been 3 weeks since the birth, and already the puppies had found their legs and, with them, their voices. Freya had taken to watching them from her corner of the living room, lying regally on a folded blanket like a queen overseeing a court of chaos. Her eyes followed their every movement, protective, patient, and just a little bit tired. Elias had started keeping a journal. Not a proper diary, but something more practical, a care log, he called it. He wrote down feeding schedules, weight gains, behavioral notes, and short sketches of the pups when they did something memorable, which was often. Each morning, after feeding and cleaning, he sat in his armchair with a cup of black tea and his favorite pen and documented their growth. The black pup, bold and eager, was named Bruno. He had a confident stride for such short legs and was the first to bark at his reflection in the mirror. Luma, the golden brown girl, was gentler, quieter, and often found curled beside Freya when her brothers were play wrestling. And then there was Ash, the smallest, with silver-gray fur and wide, curious eyes that seemed to take in the entire world. Ash was always the first to explore, the first to sneak under the table, or behind the curtain, or into Elias's slippers. The names had come easily, falling from Elias's lips as if he'd always known them. He wrote them carefully at the top of each journal page. Day 22. Bruno tried to steal a sock and fell into the laundry basket. Luma refuses to eat without Freya nearby. Ash discovered the stairs. No fatalities, thank heaven. It was during one of these peaceful mornings that the doorbell rang, and Elias, still in his robe, shuffled over to answer it. When he opened the door, a gust of cold air swept in, and with it, a tall teenager with a navy duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a beanie tugged low over thick black hair. "Hi," the boy said, slightly out of breath. "You said I could come." Elias blinked, startled, then smiled with the slow warmth of someone remembering how to. "Michael," he said, stepping aside. Come in. You're right on time. I was just about to introduce you to the zoo." Mike Vermeer was 16, lanky and sharp-featured, with the slouched posture of someone who had spent too many hours in uncomfortable chairs and too few talking to people who truly listened. His mother, a tightly wound marketing executive with more ambition than empathy, had raised him with structure and expectations. And although Mike had dutifully followed, somewhere along the way he had lost sight of where he was going. But now, standing in his grandfather's sunlit living room, surrounded by the squealing, tumbling bodies of 3 German Shepherd puppies, something in him shifted. "Whoa," he murmured, dropping his bag and kneeling down. "They're alive." Elias chuckled. "That's one way to put it." Bruno, as if summoned by destiny, barreled into Mike's lap with an enthusiastic yelp, tail wagging so hard it sent him off balance. Mike caught him, laughing despite himself. "This one's mine," he declared, eyes wide with something Elias hadn't seen in a long time, wonder. "His name's Bruno," Elias said. "I think he picked me," Mike said, lifting the pup in both hands and holding him close. Over the next few days, the apartment reshaped itself again. Mike set up his laptop on the dining table, began filming short clips of the pup's antics, and edited them into neat little videos. He added subtitles, background music, and quick cuts. Then, on a whim, he created a blog, Life with Freya. The title came from one of Elias's journal entries. They posted daily updates, puppy milestones, photos, sketches Elias had done of the trio sleeping in a pile, and notes on Freya's mood. The audience began small. A few classmates of Mike's, a cousin in Utrecht, a retired librarian in The Hague. But the stories spread. People responded to the softness, the healing. Comments came in with messages like, "These pups are saving me this winter," and "Your drawings make my heart feel full again." Then, one evening, Elias opened an envelope bearing the embossed seal of De Witte Rouse Primary School, one of the most respected institutions in the city. He read the letter twice, then a third time. "They want me to illustrate a children's book," he said, stunned. "A collection of animal rescue stories written by the students. They saw the blog, they liked my drawings." "That's incredible," Mike said, genuinely delighted. "Are you gonna do it?" Elias hesitated, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. "It's been years since I held a brush professionally, but yes, I think I will." Freya watched them from her spot beneath the window, her tail thumping once against the floor as if in approval. Bruno snoozed in Mike's lap, while Luma and Ash curled in a small sunlit patch near the radiator. Later that night, Elias sat at the kitchen table while Mike typed up the next blog post. He sipped his tea and let his eyes drift over the room. The toys scattered across the floor, the chew marks on the bottom of the couch, the worn blankets turned into tiny forts. He wasn't just documenting life anymore. He was living it again. And though the snow still clung to the edges of the city, inside this small apartment, Spring had already arrived. A late winter sun filtered through the tall, frost-kissed windows of Elias Vermeer's apartment, its soft light casting elongated golden streaks across the living room floor. The warmth was faint, but to Elias it was enough. Freya lay beside the radiator, her head resting on her outstretched paws, eyes half-lidded in a peaceful doze. Nearby, the puppies, Bruno, Luma, and Ash, had finally collapsed into a heap of tangled limbs and twitching ears after a particularly chaotic morning of chasing each other through the kitchen and unraveling Mike's socks. Elias sat in his armchair, a sketchpad resting on his lap, pencil hovering mid-air. He wasn't just drawing anymore, he was remembering, recording, reclaiming a rhythm he'd once known by heart before grief had silenced it. He stared at the window, where Freya had first brought her puppies one chilly morning, sitting proudly as the sunlight lit their fur like firelight. That image had burned into his mind. Now, his fingers moved with purpose, capturing it again. Freya's alert posture, the curve of Luma's golden back pressed against her mother's chest, Bruno's floppy ear folded absurdly, and Ash, head tilted as if listening to some invisible music. The sketch was more than likeness. It was emotion rendered in graphite and memory. He pinned the finished piece above the mantel, where Clara's favorite fern once stood. Then he did another. The puppies playing with Mike's shoelaces. Another. Freya curled beside Maureen's offered hand. The walls slowly transformed into a living gallery, not of sorrow, but of rebirth. By midday, Mike had left to meet a friend across town, giving Elias space and quiet. A rarity now, and not unwelcome. As he poured himself a second cup of tea, a gentle knock sounded at the door. He opened it to find Maureen standing there, cheeks flushed with cold, her auburn hair loose beneath a wool beret the color of storm clouds. "Busy?" she asked, holding up a thermos and 2 paper cups. "Never for you," Elias smiled. "Come in." "I was thinking," Maureen began as they sat, the smell of cinnamon tea curling between them, "about something I haven't done in a long time. I wanted to visit Oscar. Would you come with me?" Elias looked at her, surprised. Her voice had been steady, but there was something tightly held beneath it, like a note sustained too long. She noticed his hesitation and gave a small shrug. "I understand if you'd rather not. It's a bit outside the city." "No," Elias said gently. "I'd be honored." They left the apartment an hour later, bundled in coats and scarves, with a small portfolio folder under Elias's arm. The tram ride took them through the quieter neighborhoods of Rotterdam, past canals still laced with thin ice and rows of tilting bicycles locked together like huddled friends. The park was tucked behind a quiet residential quarter, a place Elias had never visited but immediately recognized as sacred. It wasn't large, just a half-acre of wild grass, birch trees, and low hedgerows. At the center was a small stone circle set into the earth, each marker unique and hand-carved, surrounded by daffodils struggling to push through the frost. Maureen led him to a simple stone with the name Oscar de Vries, etched in sloping, imperfect letters. Beneath it, someone had once carved a line of paw prints that trailed into the corner of the stone. "We used to come here after school," she said quietly. "There's a dog field just beyond those trees." He'd run until he collapsed into the grass, laughing. He wanted to be a veterinarian. Her voice caught, but she didn't cry. She'd shed all those tears years ago when the wound had still been raw. Now the pain lived differently. Less violent, but no less true. Elias knelt, opening the folder. Inside was a copy of the window sketch, Freya and her pups in the light. He had adjusted the layout slightly so the pups curled together in a soft spiral like a living wreath. "I made this for him," he said, voice low. Not because I knew him, but because I know what it means to be changed by something small and helpless. He gave that to you. Freya gave it to me. Maybe now, he can have a part of her too. He placed the laminated drawing at the base of the stone, tucking it between two rocks so it wouldn't fly away. The image looked almost surreal under the pale winter sky, like a dream made visible. Maureen knelt beside him, gloved fingers tracing the carved paw prints. He would have loved her, she whispered. All of them. They sat in silence for a while, watching the light shift through the bare branches, their breaths clouding the air. Eventually, Maureen stood and reached out a hand. Elias took it without question. On the tram ride back, Maureen leaned her head against the window, eyes closed, face relaxed. Elias stared out at the city as it drifted past, familiar now, but somehow new. He thought of Clara, of Mike, of Freya and her sleeping pups, and of Oscar, whose legacy still lived on in quiet ways. That evening, Elias returned to his sketch pad, but not to record the dogs or the apartment. He drew the park, the stone, the birch trees. He drew Oscar, imagined from memory and feeling. A boy with windblown hair, a crooked smile, and muddy sneakers, running through tall grass with a German shepherd puppy at his side. He pinned that drawing next to the others. Not to mourn, but to remember, and to welcome him home. The days had grown longer, the sun stretching golden fingers across the rooftops as winter surrendered to the tentative arrival of spring. In the apartment above Vanderland Street, light no longer felt like a stranger. It filled every corner of Elias Vermeer's home, washing over Freya's resting form, glinting off the scattered chew toys, warming the soft snores of puppies tangled beneath the kitchen table. The apartment was full of motion, of breath, of small chaos, and increasingly of the gentle hush that comes before parting. Bruno, Luma, and Ash were 10 weeks old now. Their paws had grown clumsy with rapid growth, ears too big for their heads, eyes still too innocent for the world. Each day, Elias sketched them anew. Bruno clambering onto the sofa as if he owned it, Luma curling in a sunbeam near the balcony door, and Ash, forever the explorer, digging with great seriousness in a flower pot he wasn't supposed to touch. Freya watched them with the resigned patience of a mother who had done her part. She had begun to step back, letting them test the world. Mike had taken over the blog completely. What had started as a collection of charming updates had become something tender, honest, and deeply human. Posts about the pup's development were interwoven with reflections on grief, second chances, and found family. Photos of Elias drawing beside a sleeping Freya, of Maureen laughing as Bruno tried to chase his own tail, and of Mike himself, smiling again, had touched thousands. It was through one of these posts that they received the email. The subject line was simple: "In love with Luma and Ash." The message came from a retired couple living just outside Utrecht, Theo and Isolde van Meer, who had been following the blog for weeks. Theo, 72, a retired railway engineer with a silver beard and a fondness for baking, and Isolde, 69, a former school librarian with large glasses and an even larger heart. They lived in a house surrounded by tulip fields, with a greenhouse full of succulents and no children of their own. Their elderly beagle had passed the year before, and they weren't looking to replace him. They were hoping to welcome new life. Theo had written, "We don't want to split them if we don't have to. Luma and Ash seem like they belong together. If there's any chance, we'd be honored." Elias read the message aloud in the living room, the glow of the laptop screen lighting up his face as Mike sat beside him, Bruno asleep on his lap. There was a silence, soft but heavy. "You knew this day would come," Mike said gently. "I did," Elias replied, closing the laptop. "But knowing doesn't make it easier." They arranged the visit for the following weekend. When Theo and Isolde arrived, it felt less like strangers crossing the threshold and more like old friends returning. Theo was tall and broad-shouldered despite his age, his handshake warm and steady. Isolde had kind, watery eyes and wore a knitted scarf dotted with paw prints. The moment they sat on the floor, Luma was in Isolde's lap, and Ash was already chewing the hem of Theo's coat. "They've chosen us," Isolde said, laughing through tears. That night, after the couple had left with promises to return the next morning for the handoff, Elias found Mike sitting by the window, staring at the darkened street. Bruno lay beside him, head resting on Mike's foot. "I think I want to stay," Mike said quietly. Elias turned, surprised. "I mean, really stay," Mike added. "Not just visits on school breaks. I talked to my mom last night. I told her I'm tired of feeling like a project." He paused, searching for words. "Being here, it's the first time in a long time that I felt like I'm allowed to just be. With Bruno, with you." Elias crossed the room, his voice softer than he intended. "What did she say?" "She didn't say yes at first. You know how she is." He did. Mary Ann, Mike's mother, was a formidable woman. In her early 40s, tall, slim, and always sharply dressed, she had built a career in corporate strategy through sheer force of will. She was elegant, driven, and perpetually in control, but that control had come at a cost, especially to her son. She said, "It's not practical, that I need structure, goals." Elias sighed. "She's not entirely wrong. I know, but she came around. She said she'd give me 3 months. See how it goes. She wants to meet you again, face to face this time." Elias chuckled. "She never forgave me for giving you that slingshot when you were 7. "I still have it," Mike grinned. "But now I shoot tennis balls for Bruno." The next day, the apartment was quieter. The handoff was gentle. Theo and Isolde arrived with a basket lined in fleece, 2 new collars, and tears already forming. Luma licked Elias's hand one last time. Ash, ever dramatic, howled briefly when Freya nuzzled him goodbye. Then they were gone. Bruno sat near the door for a while, confused. Freya padded over and lay beside him, placing a paw over his tiny frame. Mike sat nearby, silent. By evening, the apartment felt too large, too still. Elias found himself lingering at the door of the spare room, now stripped of its second nest. But later that night, as he sketched Bruno sleeping in Mike's lap, he realized the silence wasn't emptiness, it was space. Space for something new, space to grow. And as the moon rose above Rotterdam, Elias Vermeer, father, grandfather, artist, and now keeper of a small, loyal dog, knew he had once again become something he thought he had lost. A man needed, a man chosen, a man no longer alone. The morning light spilled over Vanderlaan Street like a whispered benediction, gilding the brick walls in honeyed gold and casting long, softened shadows across the cobbled pavement. Spring had arrived, not with the noisy eruption of flowers or fanfare, but with quiet gestures. The gentle coo of doves nesting in the eaves, the distant jingle of a bicycle bell, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the corner bakery. Elias Vermeer stepped onto the sidewalk outside his building, the leash in his hand taut with youthful energy at the other end. Bruno, now nearly 4 months old, was still very much a puppy, his paws oversized, his gait clumsy with enthusiasm, but his gaze alert and eager. His coat had deepened into a rich black, flecked with touches of dark brown at his legs and tail, and he trotted ahead with his tail high, stopping occasionally to sniff a railing or greet a passing pigeon with a bark that startled no one. Freya walked beside Elias without a leash. She didn't need one. She stayed close, glancing up at him from time to time with the knowing look of an old soul who had seen enough and learned to trust again. Her gait had slowed slightly, but there was pride in it still, a mother's calm poise, the echo of a survivor's strength. Mike walked just behind them, his phone tucked in his back pocket for once, a folded pamphlet in one hand. He was taller than before, more in presence than in stature, his movements less uncertain. He wore a navy hoodie under a denim jacket, his dark hair messily swept back, and his eyes carried the quiet confidence of someone who had found something worth staying for. They turned the corner at the end of the street and walked into the alley behind the building. Elias had spent the better part of the previous afternoon brushing the brick facade clean, sweeping away cobwebs and years of neglect. Now, freshly mounted above the small wooden bench outside his door, hung a hand-painted sign carved from pine. Freya's porch, where all beings are welcome. Elias had chosen every word carefully. It wasn't just about pets, it was about kindness, about second chances, about the kind of love that arrived not with declarations but with soft eyes and wagging tails and children returning home when they were ready. As they stood admiring the sign, footsteps echoed from the stairwell behind them. Maureen emerged from the side entrance, a rolled-up poster tube tucked under one arm and a bright orange watering can in the other. Her auburn hair was tied up today, a pencil stuck through the messy bun, and she wore faded jeans dusted with chalk and paw prints, and a T-shirt that read, "I speak fluent meow." "I was wondering when you'd unveil it," she said, nodding at the sign. "You inspired it," Elias replied. "That and Bruno stealing everyone's shoes this week." Maureen laughed. "He's just trying to encourage visitors." Together, they crossed into the small community room on the ground floor of the building, a space that had sat unused for years, until Maureen had quietly begun to transform it. Where once there had been bare walls and dusty chairs, now stood rows of bright cushions, posters of pet nutrition guides, and a low shelf stacked with first aid kits, brushes, and leashes. Maureen unrolled the poster Elias had painted, a whimsical watercolor of a dog, a cat, a rabbit, and a bird, all seated around a miniature table set for tea. Across the top, in curling script, it read, "Pet Companions Class, free lessons every Saturday at 10. The community bulletin board had gone up the week prior. Flyers had already been distributed to nearby apartments, cafes, and the vet clinic down the street. And today was the first class. By 10:30, the room buzzed with energy. An elderly widow named Gerda, with snow-white hair and large sunglasses, brought her miniature schnauzer named Pom. Pom wore a sweater stitched with little ducks and barked incessantly until Maureen gave him a chew stick and a scratch behind the ears. A young couple, Sander and Noor, arrived with their newly adopted rescue tabby named Lenta, who peeked out from a carrier with round golden eyes. Even Elias was surprised to see Mr. Van Dalen, the notoriously grumpy landlord, wander in with an aging tortoise named Napoleon tucked under one arm like a sleeping handbag. Elias sat at the back with his sketch pad, capturing the joyful absurdity of it all. Pom howling during the grooming demo, Lenta climbing into Maureen's bag in protest, Napoleon slowly circling the table legs. He sketched Maureen laughing mid-sentence, one arm gesturing toward a chalkboard filled with pet CPR diagrams, the other holding a canister of treats. And he sketched Mike, too, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching it all with quiet pride. When the class ended, Elias stepped outside to find something extraordinary. The alley, once gray and forgotten, was now alive. Neighbors lingered, chatting over coffee cups and shared treats. A table had been set up with tea, biscuits, and bowls of kibble for the four-legged attendees. Children ran past, one with chalk dust on her knees and a leash in her hand, trailing behind a yipping Pom. Someone had hung string lights between the buildings. Someone else had tied streamers to the bench. The air buzzed with laughter, with thank yous, with new beginnings. Elias stood in the center of it all, one hand resting on Freya's back, the other sketchpad tucked under his arm, and felt something he had not felt in years, not since Clara's laughter had last echoed through their old hallway. He felt home. Mike approached him, holding 2 cups of warm cider, one of which he offered silently. Elias took it. "She's staying here too," Mike said, nodding toward Maureen. "She got permission to use the space full-time." "She's got the soul of a caretaker," Elias replied. Mike hesitated. "You do too." Elias turned, surprised. Mike looked straight ahead, sipping his cider. "Just thought you should know." It was late afternoon by the time the last guest left. Elias, Mike, and Maureen stood under the soft glow of the lights, watching Bruno do slow laps around the bench, chasing shadows. "I used to think I was nearing the end of things," Elias said, "but maybe this is just a different beginning." Maureen placed a hand on his arm. "Sometimes the end of one season gives birth to another." Mike looked up at the sign above the porch. "It suits this place," he said. "And you." They sat there as twilight gathered, the 3 of them joined not by blood or tradition, but by choice and healing. And as Freya laid her head in Elias's lap, Bruno flopped down with a dramatic sigh at Mike's feet, and the final golden streak of sun vanished behind the rooftops, Elias Vermeer smiled. His family was no longer gone. They were right here, and the light at the end of the alley had never felt brighter. Sometimes, miracles don't come with lightning or thunder. They come quietly, on 4 trembling paws in the middle of a snowstorm, on the doorstep of a man who thought his story had already ended. Freya wasn't just a dog in need. She was a messenger of grace. Through her, Elias found family again. Through her, Mike rediscovered joy. And through her, Maureen began to heal from a pain no words could carry. This story reminds us that God's miracles are often wrapped in the ordinary, tucked inside a quiet knock on our door, a moment of kindness, a second chance we never saw coming. In a world that moves too fast, may we all learn to slow down, enough to notice the Freyas in our lives. So if you've ever felt lost, alone, or forgotten, know this: you are never too broken to be found, and never too late to begin again. May the Lord bless everyone who's watching this. May He guide your steps and bring unexpected light into your darkest corners. And may you always remember, every alley has an end, and at that end, there just might be love waiting. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Leave a comment below. What was your favorite moment in the story? Like the video if you believe in second chances. Subscribe to join us for more stories of hope, healing, and the quiet power of love. And share this with someone who needs a reminder. God still works miracles, even in the quiet. God bless you, and may you always find your Freya.